Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Amazon, proud sponsor of WPLN's daily show, This Is Nashville, engaging our differences so we can discover our unity. More on Amazon's community work at aboutamazon.com.
I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools in the United States were unconstitutional. A year later, in response to the developing plans to comply with the ruling and desegregate classrooms, a wave of violence swept across the South. The violence reached Nashville on September 10th, 1957, the eve of the first day of planned school integration, when the Hattie Cotton Elementary School was bombed. This was the first of 3 civil rights era bombings in Nashville. Joining us today to discuss the bombings, the terrorist network behind them, and the ties between the FBI and the KKK is Betsy Phillips, author of the book Dynamite Nashville, Unmasking the FBI, the KKK, and the bombers beyond their control. Now, later in the show, we'll be joined by Dr. Learotha Williams, Jr., professor of African American and Public History at Tennessee State University and coordinator of the North Nashville Heritage Project, and Linda Wynn, historian, co-founder of the local Conference on African American Culture and History, assistant director for state programs for the Tennessee Historical Commission, and former history professor at Fisk University. But now, I'd like to welcome Betsy Phillips back to This Is Nashville. Betsy, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations on your book, because I remember when I moved to town, you were one of the first people I met, and we spoke. And I spoke to you, and you gave me a good sense of the city's history, and we talked about your work on this book. So I know it's been a long and arduous process. So congratulations to you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for tolerating hearing these stories multiple times.
I think it's important to hear them multiple times because there's many, many layers to understand and to ingest. Okay, so you cover 3 nonviolent bombings in the book. Tell us a little bit about those and why you decided to write this book.
Right. Well, so the 3 bombings are the Hattie Cotton School bombing in 57, then the Jewish Community Center bombing in 58, and then the bombing of the home of Z. Alexander Luby, who was a civil rights attorney and also a city council person. So the summer before the anniversary of the Hattie Cotton bombing, the 60th anniversary, they were bringing the kids who had desegregated first grade in Nashville, they were bringing them back for a bunch of events and to celebrate. And I thought that I was just going to write something for the scene that was like, okay, here's who did it. Mm-hmm. Because I assumed that it would be a situation similar to Birmingham where everybody knew who had committed the bombing. But in our case, nobody had just come forward and said it. So I started to look into it and I realized, there actually isn't any real conventional wisdom on who did this bombing. It is kind of known that the KKK did it. And then I started to look around for have other people looked into this bombing, in the time since it happened. And the only other person that I could find was Demetria Kalodimos, who had the FBI file. And she let me look through her copy of it. And I realized towards the end of the file that there was a confession in there. Mm. And so I was like, oh, and it wasn't the people who had been arrested. So that kind of got me down the rabbit trail because I was like, A, it's weird that nobody knows who did this. And now B, it's even weirder that the FBI had somebody say, this is who did it. And here's how I know they did it. And so then I started to look, and because I thought, well, clearly this must be a pattern. You don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to bomb a school. You work up to it. Or if you bomb a school and it's successful, you go on. And that's when I was looking and I was like, oh, okay, the Jewish Community Center and then Luby's bombing. And then I was like, okay, well, now we have 3. So that is definitely a pattern. And I started requesting FBI files and running into various roadblocks on that. But as I started to do the research, I was like, oh, these are connected. And then as I started to do more research and realized the reason that these stopped here is not because they were solved or anybody was brought to justice, but because by the time they bombed Z. Alexander Luby's house, they had now figured out like how successfully to pull off a bombing and get away with it. And then they had kind of switched gears to now they were working up to how do we kill people and get away with it.
Okay, so one of the things, you wanted to find out who perpetrated the bombings, but also like how this could remain unsolved for 60 years.
Right.
What did you find out?
Right. So one of the more disturbing things that I found out was that from the start, the FBI was not helping investigate these bombings. And in fact, in some cases, they were actively thwarting the solving of these bombings. Like with the Hattie Cotton bombing, they had 2 witnesses who came forward before the bombing and said, there's dynamite in town. John Casper and this group of people are plotting against a school. You have to do something. And the FBI didn't share that information with the Nashville police. And then after the school was bombed, I found a memo that was dated September 10th, so the day of the bombing. But then somebody had crossed that out and like tried to backdate it so that it looked like they had informed Nashville when they had not. So I was like, holy cow. And then the more I kept looking into these bombings, now that I knew that there was like this set of bombings throughout the South that were all connected, every place I looked, states were asking, like states and cities were asking the FBI to step in and take over the investigation because it was clear to states that this was interstate, that these bombings throughout the South were all connected and that they needed somebody who had the budget and the ability to look at all these bombings as a group. And the FBI just continually said, these are local matters. This doesn't, we can't step in. We don't have any grounds for stepping in. It's all local matters, which when you consider the amount of bombings where the bomb happened and then someone called the local newspaper or the local police and said, I'm a member of the Confederate Underground and I've just bombed, and whatever they bombed. What that means is that the FBI is basically asking us to believe that not only are these racists all independently bombing these places, but then I guess that they were getting psychic messages to all call themselves the Confederate Underground. Like the idea that these aren't connected when they're all calling themselves the same thing, it just is beyond credulity.
What do you think that is? Were the FBI and in this case Nashville Police Department, were they at odds with each other?
Yes, very much so. And for good reason, because the Nashville Police Department at that time was incredibly corrupt and they beat people and sometimes killed them. So there's an interesting thing. It doesn't come up in the book, but Vincent Crimmins, who was one of the men who was arrested for the Hattie Cotton bombing, and who was taken into the police station and given a lie detector test, which turned out to be they just beat you with a 2x4 until you told them what they wanted to hear.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So they're trying to beat a confession out of him. So he was a Klan member, right? And he was a pretty terrible person just in general. But while he was in jail, the Nashville police killed a black inmate. And Vincent Crimmins was the only person willing to testify against them. So it's like so many strange bedfellows in this where it's like, you just wouldn't expect like that. You'd think a Klan member would be like, oh, that's great. Go police. But no, right? So I think the FBI was hesitant about cooperating with the Nashville police because it's like, if we tell you about a witness, are you going to beat the witness?
Okay.
Because if you beat the witness, then he's not going to cooperate anymore.
All right.
But then also I think that the FBI was like, it's more important to us to get well-placed informants in these terrorist groups than it is for us to stop them from doing these terrorist acts that as of yet haven't hurt anybody.
And I really find that point fascinating and not very surprising given the time and era we're discussing. You find this connection between the Klan and the FBI here in Tennessee. Tell us a little bit more about these well-placed informants and who effectively was running the Klan during this time. Right.
So one of the most disturbing things that I found was when President Trump had those JFK files released, they accidentally released some of the Martin Luther King files in that batch. And in those files, I found a memo where J. Edgar Hoover is bragging to the president and to the Justice Department that's like, we are running the Klan in Tennessee. Like, we control the Grand Dragon. We tell him whether or not he can be violent, and our running of the Klan has kept the Tennessee Klan from being as violent as it might be. Now, he wrote that memo in 1965. So if you remember the events of 1968, you might have some questions about just how true that is, and whether or not, they've really intended for the Klan to be nonviolent. Now, David Garrow, who is a historian who knows more about this era than anybody, he thinks that that is when the FBI took over the Klan, but it's not clear from the FBI files. They say that they took it over after there had been a big event that the governor had to call in the National Guard. And I suspect that that was the Clinton riots in 56. And one of the reasons that I think that it happened earlier, that Garrow lets on, is that there was then this split in the Klan, where the Klan in Tennessee, the United Klans of America, they did start to be like, I'm going to use the term less violent, but please know that that's like with a million scare quotes around it. And people were leaving the UKA and forming this group called the Dixie Knights or the Dixie Clans, so that in order to be more violent. So to me, just like looking at the evidence, it suggests to me that when the FBI was like, okay, we're going to be less violent, then a bunch of people were like, well, then we're out. We're going to go be more violent over here.
There's a couple fascinating points you make between class and gender.
Yes.
You write that racists permeated every class of white Nashville society, but you also write that women racists were ignored, even though they were heavily involved.
Yes.
And their participation was crucial to the segregationist
absolutely.
movement.
Yeah. I mean, they were at the schools, when the schools were desegregating, most of the crowd was women, was white women. The people who were throwing bottles and rocks and hurling epithets at these 6-year-old children were women, were the mothers of these poor kids, like their peers. They also provided places for like John Casper to stay that kept him out of, it's hard for police or the FBI to surveil him because he had like different women in town that he could stay with. They also, helped coordinate events but basically they were invisible to the police and the FBI. The police and the FBI both just seemed incapable to believe that women had the ability to be doing these evil things.
Something that you told me when we first met, you said that at the same time that the Klan and other racists were out here developing their bombing skills, working with dynamite, students, churchgoers were training to lead the civil rights movement. That's a really weird dichotomy.
Yes.
And it really helped me understand the history of Tennessee, Nashville, and where we're at now. Talk to me about that, because it's really interesting when you see these bombings as potentially like the precursor to the violence that we saw in the civil rights movement.
Right. Yeah. And like one thing that I understand why people say like, well, Nashville was just like nothing was happening here. And then the kids came and they had this training. But the truth is there had been over 50 cross burnings in the decade before the civil rights movement got its start here. So the community, and I mean that like both black and white, because the cross burnings happened both in black and white neighborhoods. So the community was already under this kind of racist violence. And it does seem like the second that Brown versus Board of Education passed and the NAACP started suing these schools, I mean, like, it is time to desegregate, that motivated racists. They were like, then we have to figure out ourselves how to organize. So they were already organizing in response to school desegregation. And then when the sit-ins started here, you saw that like that kind of became a even more galvanizing moment when they were like, okay, well now, we have to figure out, these folks are figuring out how to force a region-wide change. So we need to figure out how to work together and force a region-wide response to that change.
You interviewed a person of great importance when it comes to Nashville bombers, Gladys Baker Carney Girgenti. Can you tell us about her? Because you had this visit with this woman, and you expressed being confused by her wit, her charm, her humor. What did you become aware of? Tell us a little bit about her and what you became aware of after you sat down face-to-face with this woman to interview.
Right. So Gladys Girgenti was the woman who organized the attempted bombing of the temple in Belmead in 1981. And I went to talk to her because I thought there just can't be that many racist bombers in Nashville. They must know each other, or at least know of each other. I mean, it's a small circle with a certain skill set. And so I wrote her a letter, and I was like, I'd like to ask you some questions about J.B. Stoner, people from the book. And she wrote me right back and was like, I don't write so good. Can you call me? So I called her. She's like, come visit me. And that she lives like 15 minutes from my house.
Okay.
Like, it was really wild to be like, wow, one of the most infamous racist bombers in our city's history is just a little old woman in Madison, But I went to talk to her, like you said, I found her incredibly charming and funny. I also realized that there was a lot of, I talked to Hal Hardin, who prosecuted her for that attempted bombing. And I asked him if he had asked her about the earlier bombings. And he was like, oh, no, she was from Detroit. And I realized, they never knew. She moved to Detroit to marry Nick Girgenti, but she grew up here. She was born and raised in Nashville, and she came here after Nick died because this was her home. Mm-hmm. So they never suspected her. And I didn't, I came not to suspect her either, but she definitely would have been a good resource had they realized that she was from here and that she knew all these people.
I got to go to break in a second, but you talk about meeting her and how, as a white person, as a white woman, seeing her, parts of her personality are very endearing.
Right, yeah.
And how that could sometimes be a gateway to say that, this person's a racist, but maybe they're not all that bad. And it was a realization for you, an awareness moment for you in that. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I found that actually very terrifying because it made me, I came into that apartment and I knew all of the things that she had been credibly accused of. And then I had done my research, so I knew of other things that she has been suspected of. I knew this is a very dangerous person who's been constantly underestimated. And yet, as I was sitting there realizing, I like her. Mm-hmm. I'm enjoying this conversation with her. And it brought me up short because if I, who am trying to solve these bombings, who know all this terrible stuff about her, am finding her, that my instinct is I want her to find me as charming as I find her, then how, if you had just sent a police officer to speak with her and he didn't have any of this background, it became much more frightening, but also much easier for me to understand this is one of the obstacles to these things getting solved, is that people's inherent racism gets in the way. Their desire for another white person to like them can get in the way of them, acting in solidarity with non-white people.
That's a fascinating awareness you've come to. Now, before we go to break, I just want to note for listeners that you also did an interview with WPLN reporter Mariana Bacallao that will be coming out next week when your book is released. So we look forward to hearing more. Listeners, pay attention to WPLN.org or our air for more on that. Now, let's go to break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Betsy Phillips about her book and invite two local historians to discuss the impact of what happened in Nashville during the civil rights era on current and how it's affecting current events in Nashville right now. You stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil A. Colonna, and this is Nashville. We're talking with Betsy Phillips, author of the new book, Dynamite Nashville, Unmasking the FBI, the KKK, and the Bombers Beyond Their Control. In the book, she details the circumstances of 3 violent bombings in Nashville, the investigation from law enforcement agencies, some of the players, and she explores the question of why these bombings remain unsolved. I want to thank again to Betsy Phillips for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, now your book reads very much like a detective procedural novel or guidebook, and I can imagine like drawings and pictures on a chalkboard or a really giant whiteboard as you're piecing this together. Is that accurate?
What happened more on my computer, but yes, I do have notebooks that are like filled with circles and squiggly lines and question marks. So, yeah.
With all the names in there, I guess if you had a whole bunch of string, it'd be tough to get around your house.
Right, exactly.
Okay, but you're really frank and casual in the way you write about it, as if you were telling the story to someone over dinner. And as we mentioned before the break, you mentioned how personally, you feel about the information, the stances, and the situations. And sometimes historians remove themselves from these things. Why did you include your personal feelings and how it affected you in researching this? Why did you include all of that in the book?
Right. Well, I really wanted people in Nashville to read the book. And I think a lot of times when historians write histories, they end up writing for other historians, which is fine. I mean, if that's what you want your book to do. But I wanted anybody who picked up the book to feel like, oh, okay, I'm with a person who, and as not, these are people that I'm sitting with PhDs and like years of experience, but I wanted to come at this with like, hey, I am just also a regular person. I'm a little more stubborn than most people, so I was willing to wait around to get these files, and I was willing to hound people until they gave me what I wanted. But other than that, like the stuff that I'm finding out is stuff that you could also find out. And the stuff that I have feelings about is stuff that you could have feelings about. And one of the things that I think just from living in Nashville for so many years is that, and this is true throughout the nation, but I'm speaking as a white Nashvillian, is that white Nashville has pushed all of our town's racist problems off on Black people. But Black people and people of color in general can't solve racism. And they can't, if you think about the white supremacists who marched this past weekend, if 1,000 people of color had shown up to oppose them, that would have, for them, been evidence and justification for what they were doing. If we want to defuse those situations and make those folks feel embarrassed to hold those public opinions, it has to be white people who stand against them. That's what's going to be effective. And so I felt like it was important for me to model as a white person who isn't, I'm not by any stretch perfectly non-racist. Like I just can't be. I'm a 50-year-old woman raised in America. Like I'm going to have these racist beliefs even if I don't realize it. And so I wanted to show that, like, you don't need to be an ally. like some perfect social justice person who knows all the right lingo and has all the right opinions. You just have to want to be somebody who's committed to the truth and committed to the well-being of our neighbors, and our neighbors are everybody. So like, if you, like me, are imperfect, but you want to move the city towards a better place, then it's possible. Like, look, me too, I did it. This is where I was. These are the assumptions I had, and here's what challenged them, and here's where I think my blind spots were. And you might also read this material and feel like, oh, I also had that blind spot, or, oh, wow, she's missing this and this. Like, I hope that this book, like I say in the book, I hope this is just the first step.
I hear what you're saying. You're talking about the isms that we all have as Americans, being born and raised in this country, the level of misogyny, racism, ageism, and all of these things that are inherent in just being a citizen, and things we have to break free from if we want our country and ourselves to be different. One of the through lines in the book, you show how the racists of the 50s, 60s, 70s are still influencing the modern extremist movement. Briefly tell me, how are they connected?
Right. Well, in one way that they're connected is just that, like, people are still alive. So, like, I know Ed Fields, who was in Nashville during this time period, and he was very good friends with J.B. Stoner. He's still in contact with white supremacists. His wife told a friend of mine that he had told the guys at Charlottesville that he disagreed with their strategy, which, means he still even knows how to contact these folks. Or like Jack Kershaw, who's probably best remembered now for being the guy who carved the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue. Well, he was one of the founders of the League of the South that helped fund Charlottesville. But he also, during this time period, was working with the poet Donald Davidson to funnel money to the Klan. So it barely counts as a tradition. It's in many ways still the same actors doing the same things. And I suspect that one of the reasons that folks feel comfortable coming here and marching here is because they are aware of this long history that Nashville has of at least kind of tolerating white supremacists. And like in the case of Jack Kershaw, trying really hard to just like, oh, that's just an eccentric.
I want to get to some of that a little bit later, but now I'd like to introduce our next guests, who are also friends of the show. Dr. Learotha Williams, a professor of African American and Public History at Tennessee State University, and Linda Wynn, historian, co-founder of the local Conference of African American Cultural History. Dr. Lee, Linda, welcome back to This Is Nashville.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Khalil.
Okay, I really appreciate you both being here. We know that Nashville, before desegregation in schools and lunch counters, we had different schools for black and white children. And of course, shopping and the lunch counters were segregated. But, Betsy writes in the book that schools that black children wanted to go to were in their own neighborhoods. And Nashville seems to be a very, very different place now, with less integration and interaction. Linda, am I seeing this right?
I think there is less integration, and I really prefer the word desegregation to integration. But the other thing that Betsy writes is that we lived in neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods were not segregated. And I can certainly attest to that. I lived in a desegregated neighborhood. On both sides of my family's house, there were whites. Whites were across the street. The principal of Pearl High School also lived across the street. Whites were on the corner. We did interact. I was telling someone this morning that the one thing I remembered my father would say, they can come and borrow anything they want to borrow, but we don't borrow anything from them. Even though I lived in a desegregated neighborhood, I went to segregated schools. I started my education at St. Vincent de Paul, which was a segregated black Catholic school. When I went to public school, all the schools were segregated. So I think there is a lot of truth to the fact that blacks wanted to attend schools in their own areas, but the problem was some of African Americans lived in those integrated neighborhoods, and the schools were in those neighborhoods. So why shouldn't someone like Kelly's son be able to go to school in East Nashville as opposed to having come all the way over to Pearl High School to go to school?
Yeah.
So that's very factual, and it's amazing, you know, and it's all because of racial segregation. And you can go back to P.V. Ferguson, 1896. You can come up to 1954 with Brown versus Board, but we all know that in Nashville we didn't go after the segregated schools until 1955, and desegregating the schools in Nashville, that case did not end until 1998.
Wow. That's recent times. I was out of college by then. Now, Dr. Lee, let me ask you this. Is Nashville more racially segregated now than in the era of the bombings? If so, what are the root causes?
Okay, it's a really interesting question and when you ask, Khalil, I started smiling because it seems as though the trend has been to make them more segregated by pushing people out of areas that I study, like North Nashville. You can't stay there anymore. As far as the integration of schools, the historically black high schools here in Nashville still seems to me as an outsider to be the black high schools in Nashville. Now, to deal with the other part of your question, the why, ever since the first black person in this state stood up and decided that he wanted or she wanted to fight for equality, there's always been some sort of pushback. Black folks, black men at least, were voting in Tennessee during its early periods, but you have a revolt that occurs in Southampton, Virginia, and it's like, okay, we can't have that anymore. When emancipation becomes a very real possibility for black folks here in Tennessee, the state says, well, y'all can be free, but not in Tennessee. Go out of state, and then ultimately you got to go to Africa. And oftentimes, and I think this is a consistent trend, the more it seems as though that African Americans were making some gains toward equality, that resistance becomes violent. Betsy references the Hattie Cotton bombing in this city. I can take you to Reconstruction, where the Freedmen's Bureau agent writes that, hey, 60 schools have been burned down in this year. And you think about it, you're like, wow.
60 schools in 1 year.
Yeah, I was like, dang, that's 60 Hattie Cottons. But all that is to say this, for most of the state's history, segregation has been a feature of life in this state. And probably, as I say that, probably could make a case that, during slavery, enslaved people lived pretty close to the plantations. But once that ended, then there needed to be some segregation. So segregation is, in many ways, not an outlier. It's a feature of life here.
I want to move up to 2024. Last weekend, we saw a very large group of white supremacists from the Patriot Front march through downtown Nashville. I want to play a clip from Senator Marsha Blackburn, who spoke out to condemn the march.
New this morning, we're hearing from Metro Nashville leaders about their conversations and actions following the white supremacist march over the weekend. Jaxie Pigeon joins us now with new information from city and state leadership. Jaxie.
Well, Nicole, Metro leaders have confirmed to News 2 that information has been requested from Metro Police and Metro Legal about known violations of law in recent demonstrations, like the one we saw with Patriot Front this past Saturday. And conversations are already in the works with those agencies, as well as with Metro Council and the Nashville Department of Transportation, to improve safety in the city. And for the first time this morning, we're hearing reaction from Senator Marsha Blackburn about the incident. She tells News 2, quote, "The actions committed in Nashville over the weekend during a white nationalist march are abhorrent by every measure, and they defy the inherent American value of equality that Tennesseans hold dear. This hatred is not welcome in our communities, and I condemn this racist and anti-Semitic attack on our fellow Tennesseans."
Okay, I want to note that elected officials, including Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, Vice Mayor Angie Henderson, Metro Council member at-large Zulfat Suhara spoke out against the march, as well as Governor Bill Lee. But as of the broadcast of this show, other notable Tennessee officials have not. Tennessee's other Senator Bill Hagerty and 3 congressional representatives that represent the city have remained silent. And this is not the first time white supremacists have come to Nashville. February, a couple of dozen members of the neo-Nazi group Blood Tribe marched through the Capitol carrying black and white swastika flags. In the past few years, there's even been a Nazi banner draped over from a bridge, white power spray painted on houses, neo-Nazis showing up at the mayoral forum in Franklin. I'm going to ask you all, but Dr. Lee, I'm going to start with you. Why do white supremacists feel so comfortable coming here? You kind of alluded to it in your last answer, but give me a little bit more detail.
As I think about it, this is something that has kind of always been happening here. Nathan Bedford.
Okay, we're on radio, but as Dr. Lee said that, I wanted the audience to know that both Betsy and Linda vigorously agreed, nodding their heads when you said that. Continue, sir.
Nathan Bedford Forrest was coronated as the Grand Wizard of the Klan right here in Nashville, right? They would come here and be initiated at Fort Negley, which is a site that we're celebrating as a site of freedom. So I said all that to say this. And it's an interesting question, though, because I'm thinking about why would they come here. When Tennessee is a upper South state, so it's a gateway to the deeper South. So you can come here, get your bona fides, and then go someplace else. In recent years, the many conservatives have been seeing this as sort of their version of Los Angeles, right? You're in a very a southern state, but it's Nashville is slowly losing its southern charm, I think.
Linda, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Dr. Williams. It's not anything new, and though you had certain members of various political persuasions speak out, sometimes actions speak louder than words, or words may, you say one thing, but you're actually doing something else. When I heard those remarks, I did have a question in my own mind about why are you speaking out, given that I tend to look at, what you're doing while you are in Congress, and it was the antithesis of what you're doing and what you're saying for some individuals. You asked the question, and I think I heard Betsy allude to it earlier. I think African Americans have been trying to solve the race problem almost ever since we've been here. I'm not saying that we've tried to solve it by ourselves, but it is a problem that cannot be solved by us. It is a problem that needs brutally honest conversation and conviction by whites. And I have felt that ever since I started teaching. We try to do everything to show that we're qualified, we're this, we're that, we're the other, to no avail. If I think about what's happening right now in terms of the political atmosphere surrounding the Democrats at this particular point, Kamala Harris or the vice president is coming under continuous assault. Or, some say she's not qualified. How can you say a person is not qualified when she was elected as the person who is serving as president? She was qualified to receive those votes. So why is she coming under attack? It gets back to the face has to be generally white.
I want to take one last break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about these issues, and we're going to talk about possible paths forward. How can we learn who is responsible for the bombings? And will Nashville and our nation ever have a serious discussion about race? You can join us by tweeting us. Join the conversation by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. I am sitting with historians Betsy Phillips, Dr. Learotha Williams Jr., and Linda Wynn. We're discussing the impact of 3 Nashville bombings Betsy writes about in her new book, Dynamite Nashville, Unmasking the FBI, the KKK, and the bombers beyond their control. Now, before the break, we discussed the virulent attitudes of racism that are alive and strong here in Nashville and across our nation, as just last weekend, members of a white supremacist group, the Patriot Front, marched through downtown Nashville, causing tumult and worry and leading to public outrage and condemnation by some, if not all, but some of our elected officials. So where do we go from here? Will Nashville have the hard but necessary conversation about our past to clear up its future? Now, Betsy, in your book, you talk about Clavern number 317, whose behaviors were problematic not only for ordinary citizens, but for the Klan themselves. And I just want to get to this. On page 17, you write that the same month that the Hattie Cotton School was blown up, the then Imperial Wizard of the Klan kicked Clavern 317 out of the Klan again for, quote, alleged uncontrollable proclivity for violence. And throughout this book, you detail the infighting that happens between different factions of white supremacist groups. That is the antithesis of this almost monumental, monolithic wall of hate that we come to think of these groups about. Talk to me about the inner workings of the groups and their relations, how it's not all what we think it is.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's more important, like we say the Klan, but it's really more important to think of it as clans, plural, in that there are all these offshoot groups. In some way, it's kind of like that old joke about the Baptist, the Baptist guy on the island, and when he's rescued, even though he's the only person on the island, he's like, that's the church I used to go to. That's kind of like how the clans are, where they're constantly breaking apart because that's not the real Klan way. Now we have to develop this real Klan. And there's just a ton of infighting all the time. There's also the fact that, just the amount of people sleeping with each other's spouses, off the charts. They're not any better to each other than they are to the outside world. And I think that still remains true to this day. Like, there's no secret, well-adjusted person who's then secretly in the Klan. You are messy your whole way. And this Clavern 317, I believe so they got kicked out of the Klan, but I also believe that one of the reasons that they wanted to leave the Klan was because they are we need more violence. We need more direct action. And in fact, the leader of Clavern 317, who would go on to be the leader of the Dixie Klan number 1, was talking by April 1960 about the necessity of starting to assassinate U.S. politicians. And so for me, when I read in the FBI files that Jack Brown, is his name, is saying, we have to start assassinating politicians, and then the house of a politician that same month here in Nashville blows up, I'm like, why is Jack Brown not the first door the FBI goes and knocks on?
You say something interesting because, you write in your book that African Americans who were in Nashville during this era, this bombing era, have, quote, always spoken plainly about its brutality, and that the, quote, rest of the city hasn't made a habit of listening. Thinking about the history of this and in light of what happened this past weekend, Dr. Lee, is the city still not listening? What about the state? What about the country?
I think we've gotten to a point now where it's almost impossible for them to not listen, right? Because news comes out in various forms now. Social media allows us to be privy to events shortly after they happen. But we still suffer from the same things as our predecessors did, in that sometimes we're indifferent, sometimes we are fearful. The only place where I see that we're better is that, we can no longer ignore it. And also, I think that this is one of the strongest things about this book, is that she removes some of the ambiguity about it. Because, ordinarily when I talk about Hattie Cotton, I would say, some terrorists or some folks that were not in favor of integration bombed this school, or they tried to assassinate Z. Alexander Luby. Now we know the names of other people. Right? We can name the people and we can name the problem. And once we do that, we can start addressing the ills.
Right. And I just wanted to butt in to say, we're even seeing that right at this moment, right? We've been talking about political response to what happened on Saturday. Marsha Blackburn, how dare her? She spoke at that anti-trans rally that Matt Walsh threw to a crowd of Proud Boys. She has never apologized for that. She has never denounced them. Even when the Proud Boys were running around trying to ruin the elections in Franklin, she didn't speak out against them. And now she wants us to believe that she's against white supremacists? Ma'am, look in the mirror.
And that's what I want to talk about, looking in the mirror. I was growing up, I was taught that if you mess up, the best thing to do is to face up to it, no matter how bad it is, because that's the only way to move on. But in many ways, we're seeing that opposite push with the push from school boards and actual lawmakers to get rid of the actual parts of our history from our textbooks. Linda, talk to me about, I understand how it's important to make sure that the children are educated and understand what the truth is, but we're talking about adults too. What is it going to take for adults to look in the mirror, to address their own spirits and souls so we can actually have some actionable improvement in this problem of racism that we're facing as a country?
That is an excellent question. It's a question that I have been asking for many, many years. Have I come up with an answer? No. I think, people tend to plan long range. If we look at the book banning in the schools today, that is the generation 10, 15 years from now that will be the leaders. If you have not been introduced to African American history, women's history, Southern history taught the right way, or, any type of history, then you're not going to be able to identify or even be empathetic to or with people that may be facing those problems. Basically, what I'm saying is that they are planning 50 years down the road, just like they did with Roe v. Wade. If you go back and you look at the Heritage Society, they were formed a month after Roe v. Wade passed, 50 years down the road. That, in my opinion, is what is taking place right now. How do we deal with adults who refuse to acknowledge the ills of the past? And I have never been able to come up with an answer or a solution other than to have that very frank, brutally honest conversation. Again, African Americans and other people, minority people, have done as much as we can do to try to be inclusive with the other group. You know, just to basically say, I used to tell my students, African Americans are the most forgiving people on the face of the earth. Because we forget and we move on, or either we don't let it keep us from being resilient in some shape, form, or fashion. It's going to take a brutally honest conversation, and who is going to open that conversation, I think, is the question.
Well, hopefully this conversation is leading to that. I could talk to you all for 3 hours. Thank you all so much. I thank my guests, historian Betsy Phillips. She's the author of the new book, Dynamite Nashville, Unmasking the FBI, the KKK, and the Bombers Beyond Their Control. Dr. Learotha Williams, professor of African American and Public History at Tennessee State University, and Linda Wynn, co-founder of the local Conference on African American Cultural History, assistant director for state programs for the Tennessee Historical Commission, and former history professor at Fisk University. Again, thank you all for being with us. Thanks for tuning in this hour. We're a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced masterfully by Mary Mancini. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Our board operator and technical director is Liv Lombardi. Masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. As always, listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get your good podcasts. Conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville, or you could call us at 615-760-2000. Leave us a message. I promise you, we do listen to them. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil A. Colonna. We'll see you on Monday, everybody, and be good to each other.